Join the coven. Mimes are scarier than clowns. A story written by Mr. Charms 505. I've heard a lot of people talk about their fear of clowns. I personally don't have any fear of them, but I can see why people might not like them. Besides the irrational fear of clowns, I think it's easy to see how some might be unsettled by a brightly painted face, clothing nobody normal would ever wear, and an act that is supposed to make people laugh, no matter what the clown is feeling inside. But I've never had a bad experience with a clown, and I do think it's sad that a few bad apples have given clowns such a bad name in modern society. But you know who can bugger right off? Mimes. I think I developed the fear of mimes a few months after the incident. If I see a white face painted with different colors like on a clown, I could care less. But the moment I see a white face painted only with black marks and highlights, my heart starts pounding wildly. I lose control of my breathing, and my arms and legs start shaking so violently I can barely stand, much less walk. The incident in question occurred in Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx. When people think of parks in New York, the first place that usually comes to mind is Central Park. But let me tell you, Central Park can't hold a candle to Pelham Bay. First off, Pelham's about 3 times the size of Central. Second, it's got way more stuff to do than Central. You have islands, beaches, nature trails, and even 2 golf courses. Third, you got far less crazies roaming around Pelham than you do Central. Well, at least for the most part. I guess I was just that unlucky one in a million. The incident I've previously mentioned occurred last October. I'm a transplant to the Bronx, even though I've lived there for 15 years. My childhood was spent in Plymouth, Massachusetts. To this day, I still get crap from my friends when they see me in my Red Sox hat and Patriots jersey. But I've been here in the Bronx long enough that I still have a large group of friends. Also, being here for 15 years, I thought I had seen everything the Bronx had to offer. I was dead wrong about that. The night in question, it was me, my friend Calvin, and his girlfriend Alyssa. It was a surprisingly warm day in October, so we had gone to Pelham Bay to relax, and by relax, I mean day drink. Cal and Alyssa also brought some Coke. But that's not really my thing, so I was fine just finishing a bottle of Wild Turkey. Well, it turns out I had a little more than I could handle and ended up passing out. When I came to, I found that Cal and Alyssa had decided to split. Those jerks. And had left a note with some cash on me saying that they were going back to their place and take a cab there and continue partying when I eventually woke up. I checked my phone and saw that it was 3:15 in the morning. My head ached something fierce, and I decided to use the cash as a ride back home instead of trying to continue the party from earlier. Groggily, I got to my feet and saw that they had dragged me off the nature trail we had been on to some trees about 20 feet off the path. With a sigh, I began the long, lonesome walk back to civilization. Walking through the wooded area was actually kind of peaceful, and the fresh air and smells were actually helping out with my hangover. I was even walking at a slower than usual pace, relishing my time in nature and not looking forward to the city smell. It always made me nauseous when I was hungover, no matter what I did or how long I spent in the Bronx. Everything was going great until I came to a stretch of the path that opened up into a field where a couple of streetlights were erected. All of them were burnt out. Nothing unusual there. But there was one in the middle of the field that wasn't, and in the middle of the beam of light cast from it was a mime. I've heard that mimes dress in all different outfits and can have wildly different makeup, but this mime was the stereotypical mime we all see in media. Black beret, a white face except for black around the eyes and lips, a black and white striped shirt, black suspenders holding up black slacks, and black dress shoes. As I got closer, I noticed the mime was actually a female. I could tell due to longer hair and, well, she had a huge chest. I'm a guy, so sue me. Anyway, it appeared she was leaning back against a wall that wasn't there under the middle of a streetlight, head down as if she was deep in thought. When I got about 10 feet from her, her head snapped up so quickly I stopped in my tracks in surprise. She turned to face me, giving me the once-over. I sort of awkwardly waved at her. "Hey there," I said, with some hesitation. After all, a female mime was the last thing I expected to meet on my walk out of Pelham Bay at 3:30 in the morning. She stroked her chin as though she was thinking about something, nodded in confirmation, then beckoned me over with a hand. Of course, I thought the situation I had found myself in to be really weird and strange. Who wouldn't have? But I didn't think at the time it'd be anything dangerous, so I said to myself, why not? And went over and joined her under the streetlight. Life is full of unexpected and weird things, and I was always told to never judge a book by its cover. So, what reason had I to fear this mime in the middle of Pelham Bay? When I got about 2 feet from her, she held up her hands to stop me, which I did. She started waving her hands about like party magicians do when they're about to perform a magic trick. She then reached behind my ear and pulled out a quarter from it and showed it to me. I smiled, knowing about that trick and having it seen at least a dozen times. With her free hand, she curled it on itself, like she was holding something that didn't allow her hand to make a complete fist. She brought the quarter above her fist and dropped it into it, and the thing seemingly disappeared into her hand. Not bad. It made me raise my eyebrows in surprise. But then she finished her trick. She brought her now free hand to underneath her almost closed, and it looked like she was grabbing the bottom of a sack or something. She then moved her hands up and down like she was shaking something, and I swear to God, I heard coins jingling. This got an applause out of me, and she took a bow. I reached into my pocket to dig around for some money. I pulled out a 5 and looked for something to put it in, but she didn't have anything I could put the money into. Seeing the money in my hand, she offered a sweet smile and simply shook her head before beginning her next trick. It was the classic walking against the wind, and she did it extremely well. When she got to the lamppost, she grabbed it with both hands, and amazingly, she lifted her lower body off the ground and waved it around like the wind was blowing against it furiously. She put any pole dancer I had ever seen to shame, and I once again clapped at the great performance in front of me. She hopped off the streetlight and gave a bow. On a whim, I decided to check my phone and saw that it was now 3:45, and the realization made a wave of exhaustion come over me. I mentally noted that getting home to bed was now the most important thing to do, and I didn't have time to waste on anything else. I started to turn to resume my trek towards the city, when she jumped in front of me suddenly, holding up one index finger and then making a begging motion with her hands. I guess she wanted to do one more trick for me, but I was too tired. "You're really good, and if this was some other time, I would totally stay and watch more. But I'm hungover and really tired, and all I want to do is get back home to bed," I explained. "But hey, I'll tell my friends about you and keep a lookout for you. Next time, have a hat to collect money in or something. You really deserve to get paid for what you do." I then stepped around her and continued down the path. I had gotten maybe 15 feet away when suddenly I felt something tighten around my left leg, which was jerked behind me and made me faceplant right onto the concrete pathway. Groaning, feeling blood dribble down my nose and tasting it in my mouth, I turned to look at me. The mime was smiling down at me from her spot in the streetlight, and it looked like she was holding onto something like a rope, except of course there wasn't any rope. Her smile wasn't like before, however. It was full of malice, and it practically oozed the vibe of someone who was a sadist. Then she began pulling the rope in. As if I really had the rope attached to my left leg, I began to get dragged toward her. Panic gripped me, and I flailed my arms wildly, trying my hardest to find whatever was attached to my leg. "What the hell are you doing?" I cried, and the mime only mimicked laughter and continued to pull me toward her. I started screaming, clawing at anything and everything around me to grab something to stop my advancement towards her. When I was dragged just outside the circle of the streetlight, she stopped and acted like she threw down the rope. She started walking towards me, very slowly, reaching into her pocket and taking out something that wasn't there. She made a motion on the thing she held in one hand, like breaking apart a wishbone or taking out the blade from a Swiss Army knife. I paled as she drew close. It wasn't just what she was doing that struck absolute horror into me, but her appearance as she was doing it. Her smile was only growing wider, and her eyes, dear God, her eyes were turning a pitch black. When she was only about a foot away, she held up her hand to me, and with her other hand, the one still clutching the knife, she drew it across her palm. It wasn't just that her white glove was cutting exactly where the blade should have been. It wasn't just that her flesh was being cut by a knife that didn't exist. It was the blood, the tar black blood that matched the makeup on her face, and the darkness of her eyes that started pouring out of the wound. I gaped, my eyes growing wide with dread at the abhorrent sight before me. The black ooze that vomited forth from her wound dripped onto the concrete path, and I could distinctly hear a hissing noise as the droplets made contact with the ground. She then leaned close to her hand, still showing the wound to me. She parted her mouth, and a long tongue, longer than any human tongue could ever be, slithered out of her mouth. It looked like a giant, fat, pink worm, the kind of tongue a monster or a demon might have. I lost control of my bowels then. It snaked its way over to her wound and began to lick up the black blood that came from the wound. The once pink tongue became splattered with black, and she shuddered with delight. She then began to advance towards me, slowly and steadily, her long tongue hanging down almost to her waist. The invisible knife poked at my face, She had a hungry look in her eyes, and I knew then, this is where I was going to die. I didn't want the last thing I saw to be that horrific face, so I turned my head away and began to weep silently, contemplating my life and everything I had and hadn't done. Suddenly, I heard the faint sound of voices in the air, seemingly coming from where I had just been. I turned back to see if I could see exactly where the voices were coming from. The mime's face was a mere inches from mine. She had retracted her tongue back into her mouth, and her face was plastered with that devilish grin. The hand that held her impossible knife was at my throat, but had paused before it did its gruesome work. Though her face was mere inches from me, her eyes shifted to the side. She had heard the voices too. Through the dead silence surrounding me, the voices came again. It was faint. They were still far off, but I distinctly heard two of them. It took my brain a few moments to process exactly what I was hearing. But as soon as it clicked, I begged whatever God there was out there to let it not be so. You see, I couldn't understand the words, but I distinctly heard a female voice, and the voice and laughter of a young child. I don't know why anyone would be walking around with a kid at that time of night, but there are a lot of parents in the world, and some of them do weird things. This one just happened to be walking around with their kid in a park that was home to a monster. The mime's grin only widened at the recognition of the voices. She stood up and turned from me completely, beginning to walk down the path I had come from towards the voices. I could only stare in utter dismay as the creature gave me up for a different prey. I was still paralyzed with fear, but I began to think that I should shout out a warning to the mother and child. I didn't want to die, but the idea of letting this thing go through with whatever sadistic plans it had for a pair of innocents made me think that dying a hero wouldn't be that bad. As if she could read my thoughts, the mime stopped about 10 feet from me. She began to turn her head back around to look at me. But she didn't stop at her shoulders. Horrible ripping, cracking, and popping sounds filled the still night air as her head slowly turned completely around on her neck to look at me. One of her arms began folding themselves back around too, adding to the already horrendous montage of flesh, muscle, and bone breaking and tearing. Eventually her hand got to her mouth, and she covered her lips with her index finger, shushing any sounds I had even thought to make with a wink. Then all at once her arm and head spun back quickly to their normal places, and she started walking towards the voices once again. I remember running, not caring who or what I bumped into. I remember getting up the flight of stairs in my apartment building in record time. I remembered slamming my front door shut, locking it, and crying hysterically on the floor right in front of the door. I was a complete mess for a week. I barely ate, I couldn't sleep, and I spent all my time searching online for anything that might tell me what the hell I had experienced. I couldn't find anything about monster mimes, urban legends about mimes, or anything like that. Time eventually began to heal my shattered mind, but now I can't even stand seeing pictures of mimes. I've run into 1 or 2 performers on the streets, but I've managed not to scream and just keep walking by them, which is a win for me in my book. But the reason I'm telling you my story now is just the other day, on my walk home from the grocery store, I heard something that made my blood freeze instantly. From a back alley I had just passed, I heard the jingling of coins in a bag, and when I turned to look, I saw a white-gloved hand beckoning to me from behind a dumpster, and a smiling face I prayed I'd never see again. So if you see a mime, just run. 99% of the time, it may be just a mime, but you don't want to risk that 1% chance that it's not.